thinking about writing your thesis, writing your dissertation, an important part will be the question of what methodology you're going to use, what analysis, what you're going to use as your terms of reference. And that might be included in a chapter called methodology, research methodology. But it's going to be drawn from the literature, so I'm not going to get caught up in the question of the boundary between the literature review and the methodology chapter, because they should flow one into the other, and in one sense the boundary is arbitrary. We're looking at the chain of evidence. We're looking at, when the case gets to court, how was the evidence collected? Has the detective who picked up the evidence been in charge of it throughout? Has it been tampered with? Has it been contaminated in any way? We're looking at the quality of the evidence that is being produced to put forward the case that you're making in the dissertation you're writing. So the question is, how was the evidence collected, and how did you spot what you were looking for? How did you know? And to do that, you will need a theoretical framework. You'll need a way of looking at the world. If I look out the window, I'm overwhelmed by the variety, the patterns, the trees, the plants, the mud, the slugs. There's so much in the world around us to look at. We need a way of filtering out the things that we're going to concentrate on. And one of the ways in which we can focus out the things, make a selection from what's in our environment, the things we want to explain and the way we want to understand them, is to use a theory. And you'll be looking through, you'll be reading. By the way, that's why when you start your research project and you haven't got your theory sorted out yet, you haven't made those choices about what you're going to use as a theory, you often feel confused, overwhelmed by the range of things you could be looking at. There's the whole beauty of the universe, and you can't take it all in at once. We need to simplify things, to attenuate those signals that are coming to us that are less important, and concentrate on the main point. And the main point is kind of a question of choice. You choose a theory that suits you. Let me take an example, because it's going to be more concrete if I give you an example. I'm going to choose the work of Lev Vygotsky. So, my theory, let's say I'm doing the work, the study, and I'm going to look at this through the eyes of a theory based on the work of Vygotsky. That's almost useless to you as information, because Lev Vygotsky wrote and published in his lifetime very little. There are two main books that are published, one edited by Jean Piaget, a selection of his work that was published in the 1960s that brought him to fame, and later work selected by other people, and then finally, latterly, a selection of his collected works, his papers that have been printed in 6 volumes. So either if you find his work, you'll find a very small, narrow range that's been selected by somebody, or you'll find everything he wrote, which he may not have wanted published. He may not have wanted that ever to see the light. We don't know. So if I tell you I'm going to use the work of Vygotsky, that doesn't tell you very much. I've got to tell you what I understand by it. So, for example, if you go to most textbooks on Piaget, the most important feature of his work is the zone of proximal development. I think you'll find that's most usually referred to. And what's meant by the zone of proximal development is the difference between the things that you can do on your own and the things that you can do with help from somebody who's more able. So I might be able to swim, but not able to dive. And so I will get the help of somebody who knows how to dive, who'll be able to talk me through easy stages, do this exercise to get in practice, do that exercise to get in practice. And in all areas of activity, Piaget said there's a difference between what you can do on your own. You may be able to sing, but you may not be able to write music. You may be able to walk upstairs, but not climb a ladder. At each stage of our development, there's things that we can do, things that we can't do, and there's a range of things just beyond what we're capable of that with a bit of help we could get through with the support of a teacher, a friend, a more able companion, call them what you like, but that more capable companion will be able to talk you through the processes. And that's the process of scaffolding. And if you read the books on if you read the books on Vygotsky, that's the most likely piece of his work that will have been picked out. And I actually think that's not the most useful part of Vygotsky. That's not what I mean when I say I'm going to use Vygotsky's framework. And the reason I don't think it's terribly useful is because it suggests that the concept I dislike is the idea of potential. There's potential for somebody to improve, and as if the zone of proximal development determines what somebody can do. And that's not, I think, in the spirit of Vygotsky, who thought that once you'd got through your zone of proximal development, there'd be another. You'd master diving and you'd dive off higher boards, or you'd master climbing ladders and you'd graduate to some higher level of activity. So what I think is important about Vygotsky is that he said that learning happens in two cycles. There's an intrapersonal cycle and there's an interpersonal cycle. The interpersonal cycle comes first. So this is the activity that's described in the zone of proximal development. You're here, you're learning, and with me we can work together. I can show you what I mean by theory, I can show you what I mean by writing about a theoretical framework, and I'll discuss it with you and I'll talk about it with you, and that's interpersonal, that we do that together. That's a class. I teach something, I present to you an activity that is about the work of Vygotsky. And then what I hope happens is that you go away and you reflect and internalise what you've learnt through the class, talking to me, talking to your peers, talking to other people. And that cycle is internal. That's what I'm not in any way involved in that. You take what I've offered you and you make it your own. You make your own knowledge. You attach it to the things that you knew before, you reflect upon it, and you make it your own piece of work. And Vygotsky says everything starts first as social and then as individual, internal. So, for example, I started, when my mother used to send me shopping, I used to have a written shopping list. She'd give me a shopping list and I'd go out, and she would give me the shopping list, I'd go and do the shopping, and I understood what it was to have a list. After a while, I'd been thinking about lists, she would then say, just get me these things. And so I would go to the shop and I'd try and remember what she told me to get her. Now, because I've been working with lists on paper, interpersonally, then I knew that if I had a count of 5 things, she asked me for 5 things, then I would remember, have I got 5 things? I'd have a check. and those things I'd learned in the interpersonal phase, but they became part of my way of thinking about lists and instructions and orders. Have I done all the things that I wanted to do? Did I start off with 4 things that I wanted to do? Can I count off the 4 things I've done on my fingers? So that Vygotsky is saying something very important about how we learn. You will hear people like me, you'll hear teachers complaining that students are only interested in getting a good mark for their work. Well, that means that the student is concentrating on this part. They're concentrating on doing the work publicly so that they get a good mark. Not all students are like that. Some students are concentrating on what can they learn. Have they internalised it? Have they picked out the things that they need for their future success? And many teachers complain that students forget things. Well, I expect you not to remember everything I tell you. I expect you to pick out the things that you find useful and to internalise them and make them part of your way of thinking. And it's through this process that Vygotsky says we develop the higher mental functions. So I learned publicly my alphabet. When I was a child, I had to chant the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M. Classes in primary schools used to chant that. It was public. It was a public activity, interpersonal, chanting the alphabet. I then used the alphabet later to organise all sorts of things in dictionaries, in road atlases, in encyclopedias, and I would be able to use the alphabet to access information that I wanted. I'd think of a word that I wanted to know the meaning of, word beginning with F, and then I'd have to recite the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, F. Oh, it comes after E. I'll look for that in the dictionary. That publicly acknowledged activity I gradually internalised, since I don't have to even think about it now. I just know what order the letters come in, whether or not the letter is at the beginning of the alphabet or at the end of the alphabet. It's become internalised to my way of thinking. And importantly, I mean, that's what the difficulty we have in evaluating the question of whether, with wonderful search engines like Bing and Google and all the others, do we really need to know anything because we can find it out very quickly? Well, the alphabet has become less important as a way of organising and sequencing information, but still you need to develop the mental capacity, the mental furniture, the mental tools that will allow you to sift and organise the information that you find. Anyway, that I'm concentrating, I've moved into looking at the detail. My central point, from the point of view of your methodology chapter, is that what Vygotsky said is not immediately obvious. He might have said zone of proximal development, and you might be using that as your framework for your analysis in your thesis. Or he might have said learning is a 2-cycle process. I mean, or you might combine the two. But if you just tell me you're going to use Vygotsky's theory, that's not enough. Because I've read Vygotsky, you've read Vygotsky, we may have come to completely different conclusions about what he said, which bits are important, which bits are difficult, which bits need explaining. And so your methodology chapter is about taking the groundwork, the basic theory. Now, I might not stop with Vygotsky. I might say, well, hang on, other people have written about him since. What did other people say? Have they extended his work? Have they criticised his work? Have they put on modifications? So although I've said I'm going to use this as my basis, I may want to develop the thinking in a way through the chapter to show you exactly how I'm looking at the world in order to simplify it, in order to make it abstract the things I want to look at and make them clear in the process of my explanation in writing my dissertation. And it's that process that you use the theory, and now this is connected, going back to Stephen Toulmin's structure of an argument. This is about how you identify what you're describing. You've described the zone of proximal development, and you're now going to go out and look at the world and say, here's an example of someone using the zone of proximal development scaffolding. This is how people are structuring their classroom in order to help the children, and they learn much better if it's done explicitly or some such argument. But this is an example. The theory is the warrant that links your observation to the claim that you are making. It's this is an example of this. This observation exemplifies the work that I've been looking at theoretically, or as I'm more likely to say, because I'm not focusing on that, I'm more likely to say, let me give you an example of somebody who has used this in order to understand what's going on in an educational circumstance. I'm looking at what is publicly available. Let me say I set you an assignment. Why do I mark an assignment? What's the purpose of marking an assignment? The purpose of marking an assignment is that I have certain standards. I have certain criteria which make an assignment successful or unsuccessful. And by marking and grading the assignment, I'm showing you, illustrating to you what my standards are. And I'm hoping that you will internalise those standards. I'm hoping that if I give high marks to people who are logical and explain things in an orderly way, you will start to think that it's valuable to make things logical and organised in a particular way. So, and that's an example of me understanding the world in terms of these interpersonal and intrapersonal cycles of learning. So the methodology chapter is about explaining what you're going to look for in the world, what things you are looking to see exemplified in the evidence that you collect, and how you're going to describe them and understand them, how you're going to pick them from the wealth of possible things you could be looking at. And that brings us to the last point I want to make, which is the point about the theoretical framework is it helps you to know what you're not going to look at. What you leave out of a dissertation is as important as what you put in. You need to know the boundaries, and you need to be able to say, you know what, I'm not going to look at that because it doesn't exemplify the theories that I'm looking at. I'm going to look at these other things because they do exemplify the things that I wanted to look at in theory. So the methodology chapter is a complicated one, and it doesn't come down to, sorry to say this, it doesn't come down to a simple statement of I'm going to do quantitative research or I'm going to do qualitative research. That's a nonsense kind of distinction. What you need to be doing is explaining how the theories you have chosen and why the theories you have chosen suit your purposes for your analysis of what the phenomena that you are looking at.